Resource Center of Buffalo, especially Mara Coven-Gelman and Andrew Viter, the Buffalo Jewish Federation, the Robert H. Jackson Center, and the U.S. District Courthouse, especially Patrick Healy.
The Nuremberg trial 70 years later, legal ethics and the Holocaust. What a terrific idea for a program, very timely, and what wonderful speakers we have. Our first speaker is Professor John Q. Barrett. Professor Barrett is a law professor at St. John's University in New York City. He's an acknowledged expert and biographer of the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, for whom this courthouse is named, the United States Supreme Court Justice and Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. Professor Barrett writes and lectures frequently on Justice Jackson, on Nuremberg, and on related issues. In fact, Professor Barrett was in Nuremberg earlier this year to participate in the events commemorating the 70th anniversary of the conclusion of the Nuremberg trial in 1946. Professor Barrett is also the Elizabeth S. Lena Fellow and a board member of the wonderful Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, which is a co-sponsor of our program. I've had the pleasure of listening and hearing Professor Barrett talk on these topics before, both at the Jackson Center and at an event in New York City, where we were playing a new movie that had come out with footage from the Nuremberg trials. I know that he is a fascinating speaker. He has a lot to say on this topic, and I'll put in one plug, and that is for his blog/email. He has something called the Jackson List, and every other week or so, if you sign up, you'll get an interesting email with some historical perspective about usually Justice Jackson or the Supreme Court of Nuremberg. Today's entry was about Justice Jackson and his lack of fondness for baseball in light of the World Series. It was fascinating. But you can email him at barrettj@stjohns.edu or go to johnqbarrett.com and sign up for the Jackson List. I recommend it. It's very interesting. And with that, I'd like to introduce and bring up Professor Barrett.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Buffalo, a friendly and familiar place, to be in the Robert H. Jackson United States Courthouse, a well-named edifice, to be hosted by the various institutions and co-sponsors. My thanks to each of them, particularly to the judges, for sharing and leading the use of this public facility for this very important public purpose. They, of course, do their public work upstairs, and this is extracurricular, if you will, for them. But a courthouse is a temple of law, a house of the people in our legal order. And it's great to see the Jackson Courthouse used in all these different ways. What I will be doing in this talk is laying the groundwork, giving a little bit of a landscape orientation to what Nuremberg was, that will set up the rest of the discussion and the other fascinating speakers to come. And I will be using different photo images. This is another Palace of Justice 70 years ago. And the Nuremberg trial was one of many, many, many war crimes prosecutions that occurred in the European theater, and also, not to slight it, there were similarly a large number in the Pacific theater. But Nuremberg in the European theater in the post-war period. Many of these trial processes were national trials, liberated nations or military occupations, holding people accountable for crimes they perpetrated when the crimes were based in a location. So a murderous atrocity in a place with a perpetrator apprehended became a basis for a court-martial or a military commission or a Polish court or a Czech court or a Russian court or a French court, a British court, American courts, etc. Because that's where the crime occurred. In the law, of course, we call that venue. And these crimes of venue were prosecuted and were held accountable, and a fair amount of justice was done at the retail level, if you will. On top of that, there were arch criminals. There were crimes that transcended any particular venue. And the Nuremberg trial process was to deal with that high slice of perpetrators. When we say Nuremberg trials, it refers to 13. There was one and only one international trial, a four-nation US, USSR, UK, French trial, the 1945-1946 trial. And this is a photo, and I will be telling you much more about it. That alliance, which had won the war, after the first trial basically fractured and decided to do no additional international trials. So after the one and only international Nuremberg trial, the remaining Nuremberg trials, 12 more, were American-only prosecutions. Nuremberg, you see, and I'll show you a map, was in the American sector of occupation. So it was US turf, which meant Nuremberg trials by definition were then US trials once the alliance was done with the one and only international trial. So this is an aerial view at the start of the trial. And just to orient you, the defendants are in two rows in this box on the right. In front of them are two tables of defense attorneys. Across from them on the high bench, which we'll come back to, are the 8 judges, a principal judge and an alternate from each of the 4 nations. And in front of them, 2 rows of stenographers, legal assistants, law clerks, etc., assisting the jurists. The photo is taken sort of in an elevated floating position above where the witness stand was. So imagine a witness stand here in the front of the room, just above Judge Villardo's head. And opposite is the podium from which the examiner questioned the witnesses. Then arrayed behind the podium were 5 prosecution tables. This was the French table, this is the Russian table, this is the American table, the British table, and a 5th table was the overflow table for additional personnel. And the first row inside the well was also prosecution personnel. Then the seating here was press corps, and the seating upstairs was VIP visitors, including German citizens, a few on a regular basis who were located and given a ticket so that the German people could see this process, and the Allied hope was explaining to their neighbors what was going on. So that's just to orient you to the courtroom and the international trial. This is another view, and I just like it because it's a beautiful color photo. Color film was rare in 1945, and it gives you more of a ground level view of the defendants. Hermann Goering, you see in the sunglasses, because there were very bright fluorescent lights, was the lead defendant, and Rudolf Hess, and Joseph von Ribbentrop, and Wilhelm Keitel, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, etc. The helmets are MPs, nicknamed snowballs. They were armed with sawed-off sections of broom handles that had been painted white to look like nightsticks, but they were like you can get at Walgreens and cut it into 4, and that was the weaponry in the courtroom, with one exception. This is another aerial shot of the prosecution tables, and here you see, oops, lost it. Here you see the British prosecution table, and this is what I described as the overflow table. So these are various personnel. You see some of the Russian officers in uniform affiliated with the different nations. I want you to focus on this guy. And it's not that my metal detector is particularly good at all, much less 70 years after the fact, but he was wearing a sidearm. He had the one gun in the room because he was the bodyguard of Justice Robert Jackson. And that's a great thing about this room 70 years ago. But a better thing is that he's in this room this morning. So I'm pleased to introduce my friend, Father Moritz Fuchs, who is a retired Catholic priest from Fulton, New York. He came back from Nuremberg. Entered the seminary and embarked on a long life of service ever since. We were just chatting right before the program, and I said, everybody counts the anniversaries of 70 years, Nuremberg, and so forth. And it just occurred to me, this is the 70th anniversary of Moritz Fuchs becoming a seminarian, which was then a long process of study to earn the collar and to become the parish priest and so forth that he was. So that's a little bit of orienting us to Nuremberg. Let's start at the beginning, and I will go fast here, but I want you to meet Robert Jackson because we're in his courthouse and Buffalo is his town. That's what he looked like when he was a young lawyer, born in Pennsylvania, raised above the New York state line, Frewsburg, Jamestown. Largely, the path to the law was apprenticeship, 1 year at the Albany Law School, and then Chautauqua County, kind of scruffy clients, high-volume trial work. This is 1913, 14, 15. This is the courthouse in Mayville, the county seat of Chautauqua County, and this is the courtroom in that courtroom. courthouse. And the staffing of that in 1914, 15, 16 included visiting judges. And one from Buffalo, a new New York State Supreme Court Justice, Charles Sears, came to preside over trial work in the Mayville courthouse and was wowed by this young litigator, this phenom, this little farm boy from nowhere, Robert Jackson, and recruited him to Buffalo. Sears, you see, had just left a big, for its time, Buffalo law firm when he took the bench, and he knew they were hiring, and he vouched for Jackson to his partners, and so Jackson came here to work for Penny, Killeen, and Nye. Tom Penny had been the prosecutor of the assassin of President McKinley. The principal client was the International Railway Company, the streetcar line here in Buffalo. It would run over people allegedly, and they'd file tort lawsuits. And that was a high-volume trial practice, and a young lawyer like Jackson defended those streetcar cases and their appeals and so forth. So he spent a lot of time in the state courts here, less in the federal, but occasionally in the federal. And the office space was in the Ellicott Square building. So he goes from, kind of nowhere to Maysville, if you will, to the biggest office building on earth, at least, in its moment when it was built. And his office space is still up there. It's a grainy photo, but that's the grandeur of the lobby of Ellicott Square. And that's a piece of the tile in the floor that he walked across every day as he went to work in 1916, 17, 18. Of course, it's just a geometric design of, sort of Native American and even older Arabic art origins. And I'm sure it didn't register, except maybe it was beautiful, but I can't help but see the irony. This is his apartment building right down there on Johnson Park. He and his wife lived there for the time that they were in Buffalo when he was working for Penny, Killeen, and Nye. That building is still there on the corner. It was one of the apartment buildings built for the Pan American Games. That's the house next door, which allegedly is where Grover Cleveland lived when he was a law student here in Buffalo. That's a little bit less established than Jackson living next door. That's what the park looks like today and the door of the apartment building. It's a beautiful little pocket park, and it's just down the street. And that's a close-up of the front of the building. So Jackson's walk to work came right over this spot. That's my point. From the park and the apartment up to the center of the city and over to Ellicott Square, which makes for a nice historical echo and connection, and makes it appropriate, obviously, that this courthouse, which I think was probably row houses and space, and something he never dreamed would be anything like this, much less named after him, was his way to work. His work then continued back in Chautauqua County. He figured out that a young lawyer could wait a long time to rise to the top of the heap in Buffalo. And he was very well regarded and very successful, but he sort of figured out, I don't want to be 55 years old before I become a leader. And so what he did was retreated to Jamestown and resumed his practice there, and succeeded and pretty quickly became the city bar chairman, the Jamestown Bar, and then the Federation of Bars of Western New York, which meant that his counterpart, he at age 20-something, was the counterpart of the Erie County Bar President, who was age 50-something, and then the New York State Bar, and then the American Bar Association, oil and gas sections, etc. Jackson is the elected president of the ABA House of Delegates in 1932, when he is all of 40 years old. So his idea of climbing high faster and having a diverse practice that would be very challenging and national succeeded, to the point where he built a nice big house with white pillars, and he and his wife had 2 children. He had a cabin cruiser on Chautauqua Lake. He had an 88-acre horse farm. He had, kind of life by the tail, and did all kinds of law: trial, appeal, corporate, transactional, political advising, writing, research, financial, kind of you name it. He wasn't looking particularly for anything else, but he did also have a political stripe. As a young man, he had met Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt was a New York State senator. And then as the Roosevelt career, coming back from polio, rose in state politics, he kind of collected his political network of people. And in Western New York, Robert Jackson was one of those on-the-rise talents who became a proxy speaker and a supporter, and then an appointee and an assistant in the gubernatorial terms, and then Roosevelt wins the presidency. Jackson goes to Washington. He, in 7 years, rises like a meteor. 1934, he's appointed and confirmed by the Senate to be the general counsel of the Revenue Bureau. He is detailed to the SEC in 1935. He's appointed Assistant Attorney General and heads the Tax Division in 1936. He moves over and heads the Antitrust Division in 1937. He's appointed and confirmed as Solicitor General in 1938. And after 2 years of a high volume of arguments before the Supreme Court, he's appointed Attorney General of the United States in 1940. And after 18 months in that job, he's appointed an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in the summer of 1941. And he's all of 49 years old. So, there's your inferiority complex for the day, right? Don't worry, it's worse for me. I live with this. This is really where it starts in a visual sense, the path to Nuremberg. This is a joint session of Congress in May of 1940. Think of that moment in time. The war on Poland had been a quick, easy victory for the Nazis. Then the phony war period had continued into early 1940. Then the Nazis invade and conquer the Low Countries. Then they invade and they're in the process of conquering France. The European continent, by May of 1940, is about to fall under Nazi domination. And pretty soon, the early forms of the Blitz and the prospect of a channel crossing and an attack on Great Britain, the Nazis are about to conquer Europe. Franklin Roosevelt is finishing his second term, playing coy about will he accept a draft for the third term. The country's isolationist. We had not done the kind of military spending that actually might have been good stimulus during the Depression years. And now Roosevelt goes to a joint session of Congress and asks for a huge military buildup. And soon he's back and he asks for selective service. And soon he's giving military assistance to Great Britain. And you know the story from there. Arrayed across the front row of this joint session of Congress is the cabinet. It includes Harry Hopkins, the Secretary of Commerce, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and dark hair, 48 years old, young Robert Jackson, the Attorney General. Over on this other side is a Senate leader, not the most conspicuous one, a senator from Missouri named Harry Truman. Nobody quite expected that this position and that kind of stature would fall to this man in a short number of years. But that's the story. In the meantime, Jackson is appointed to the Supreme Court. This is the summer of 1941, as I said, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. And then he's a judge during the war years that embroiled the United States. Being on the bench is kind of a backwater, frankly, is how he feels about it. He offers to resign. Roosevelt kind of almost pats him on the head and says, this is a war and you're not much of a warrior. You're a law man. I want you to stay on the court, build this judicial reputation. I intend to make you Chief Justice. And after the war, there may be law tasks that you are uniquely suited to perform. Now that's a very cryptic kernel. It's not at all developed. But, win the war and then win the peace is a kind of shooting followed by law sequence of events. And Jackson is not fit for the shooting project, but he is fit for the law project. This is the court as he joins it in the summer of 1941, the junior justice in the back row right. And this is what's going on in the world. This is a photo from Warsaw of a surrender of a young boy in 1939. It's a captured photo that was used as evidence at Nuremberg. It was captured from photo albums compiled by Nazi officials and shared as holiday gifts to sort of memorialize part of the triumph and the conquests. Now, we've all seen much, much worse images, but can you imagine putting that in a celebratory photo album? That's the world situation. For the first couple of years of the war, 40, 41, 42, even into 1943, it was not certain who would win. As a matter of the Nazi aggression, look at the dominoes as they've fallen, and look at the slow involvement in the process of getting to North Africa, and then Sicily, and then Italy, and so forth. That is the American involvement. But by 1943, at least the second half of 1943, it's clear who will win. A matter of bodies, industrial might, commitment, it will be the Allies. Hitler has made the mistake of going east and tried to conquer the Soviet Union, and he's been defeated. And then the push back from the east by the USSR and the Allied British-American push from the west, in a matter of time will win. So the planning for the peace begins in a cryptic way. This is a conference in Moscow in November of 1943. It's the foreign ministers. It's Molotov and Anthony Eden and Cordell Hull And a myriad of topics are discussed and agreed to. One part of the Moscow Declaration is that we together, the Allies fighting this war, will together hold the arch criminals accountable for what they've started once they've been defeated. So kind of the Allied promise of international justice. The Moscow Declaration doesn't even quite use the word trial, but Allied project for these arch criminals for starting it is the Moscow Commitment. It's elaborated a little bit at Yalta in February of 1945. You see the gaunt Roosevelt who is dying, and 2 months later he's gone. And Yalta, of course, considers a myriad of topics, but one is this Allied commitment for accountability. And the Yalta Declaration now uses the word trial. There will be an international trial. Roosevelt dies on April 12th. Harry Truman inherits this office with all of its secrets and challenges and promises. You know, the Manhattan Project, something going on in a lab in the desert in New Mexico. He didn't know about it. The Yalta Promise. He didn't, know what to do about it, but he had now inherited it. He had to deliver on it. And so, with a consensus among his advisors, and in his own right, having a very high regard for Robert Jackson, he reaches out to Jackson to perform this legal task. We've got this promise. We're going to do an international trial. I need a lawyer to head it up. Will you do it? It seems odd to us today to ask for a president to ask a sitting Article 3 judge, much less a Supreme Court justice, to sort of perform a task, separation of powers and judging being a full-time job and so forth. It was much more common in these days, and in Jackson's case it had the particular fit of being April of 1945, heading into the summer recess of the Supreme Court, Jackson being a very autonomous jurist who wrote his own opinions and was kind of on top of his work, and a request from the President of the United States. Jackson, I think, itching for something of a challenge, told that it's a turnkey operation, if you will. There's an Allied agreement, the evidence is gathered, we're about to defeat Hitler, etc. He says yes. He commendably says yes. It's April 25, 1945. What he's really expecting is that it will be the prosecution of Adolf Hitler. That's the pitch. And his immediate inner circle of arch criminals around him. Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, and Hitler. Probably those five, if you will. In a matter of days, that all turns to ash. And Jackson's unveiled publicly as the guy who's now going to do this. Hitler, gone. Plus Goebbels and Himmler, gone with him. And although they didn't realize it, Bormann, too, gone. Goering is the one of the five who survives. There's no evidence that's been gathered. There's no detailed international agreement about how to do this. There's no trial prepared to launch to be over and done in the summer of 1945. So, good luck, Jackson. I mean, brilliant by the executive branch, right? They've almost farmed this out. It's not their problem. And this is a conference room staged photo, May 2nd, 1945 at the Supreme Court. And it's not a big grin on his face. He's smiling a little bit, thinly. He knows he's in for a very hard, chaotic, improvisational, unprecedented challenge. This is 6 days later. The Nazis surrender, unconditionally, which meant the end of Germany, which meant Allied occupation of that landmass and total control and power. And one thing we should never forget, especially as we contrast the Nuremberg process with modern efforts of international justice, is how vast the power and consensus was then, and in comparison, how partial and fitful the power is now. When there is a world war and one side loses, the winner is the rest of the world. And when the rest of the world, in a shining moment of consensus, agrees that we together will do something, it gets done. Working out the details is complicated. This is the occupation map. The sectors of occupation were the adjoining areas. So the pink area is adjacent to the USSR. That's the Russian zone of occupation. The yellow area is, in a cross France in the Channel sense, adjacent to the UK. That's the British zone of occupation. These are the occupation zones of Austria, which also were divided up that way. The red, white, and blue stripes are adjacent to France. That's the French zone of occupation. And the United States, not from the neighborhood. We get the rest. We get the blue area, southeastern Germany, if you will, Bavaria. Munich is here, Nuremberg is here. In between the two is Dachau, the first of the Nazi concentration camps. But that is US territory as of May 1945. There are many reasons why the Nuremberg trials happened in Nuremberg, but the first and only necessity that made it possible was we controlled the turf and we wanted it there. We wanted it in the blue, if you will, and not in the pink. This is a house at Westminster Abbey, a grand building. It's called Church House. It's part of the Church of England headquarters. And it's where Jackson and the Allied counterparts began to meet in June of 1945 to work out how we're going to do this. Before there could be the trial, there had to be all this diplomacy. And they met around a four-sided table. This is the American side, Jackson in the bow tie, his deputy, William J. Donovan of Buffalo, on the corner of the table, an Army lawyer named Murray Bernays, Jackson's son, Bill Jackson, who was his father's executive assistant, the Russians with their back to the camera, the French on the left, the British facing the camera. And they thrashed around this table, their transcribed, fantastic proceedings to read, to figure out how we'll do this. Very different legal systems, very different notions of crime, largely an Anglo-American alliance. So the problem wasn't the British, but the common law, civil law divide between the Anglo-Americans and the French, and Soviet law being a form of civil law, but not exactly the French form. Those are all complexities that they're working on. Plus, fundamentally, kind of on this corner of the table, the Americans and the Russians have a fundamentally different idea of what the Allied commitment is. We've committed to hold these arch criminals accountable together, said the Moscow Declaration. We've committed to have an international trial of these arch criminals to hold them accountable, said the Yalta Declaration. Great, said the Soviets. That's the verdict. They're guilty. We've agreed to that. It's just a process now to figure out how we will display them before we hang them or shoot them, or some of each. In other words, a show trial. Whereas Jackson, a lawman, an American due process man, the Anglo-American perspective says, wait a second, this is a commitment to commence an adjudication process. That means the prospect of carrying a burden of proof and proving their guilt, and in the alternative, the prospect, if we can't, of their acquittal. It will be determined in a courtroom. The result isn't fixed. You can't build the gallows yet. And that goes back and forth, and it's a fundamental impasse through the summer of 1945. Jackson, in optimism, and because the French, British, and Americans are going to agree, begins to prepare for the trial. The Russians may not be part of it, but there will be at least a three-nation trial. And so in July, they go on this scouting trip to Nuremberg. There's Jackson. It's the three nations. And they go to look at Nuremberg, which General Lucius Clay, the head military officer in the occupation zone, had proposed as the trial location. The Russians were invited, and of course they declined because they weren't sure they were joining this project. This is what Nuremberg looked like. It had been bombed to smithereens by the Allies. So, why is this being proposed as a site? Because it had this. On the outskirts of the old city, largely intact, was a courthouse building, the Palace of Justice, and this is an annex that I'll show you close up, surrounded wheel and spoke by a large prison. So a facility in the blue part of the map, the American sector of occupation, was a suitable location to do this. It could be secured and provisioned, etc., by the Americans. Yes, the stray bomb or two had hit this building. That's a glimpse of what one part of the front roof looked like. And you can see the repairs that were done on the roof of the annex. By the time the fall of 1945 had rolled around, no leaves on the trees, American military vehicles parked in front, soldiers, guards, etc. Those four windows are courtroom 600. The first slide I showed you was inside that room. So, they fix it up, they secure it, they have a space to do this. That's what courtroom 600 looked like inside, but it got swept up and rebuilt and was ready to go a couple months later. But still there was this impasse, and the impasse really first gets resolved at Potsdam. This is the conference in the summer, July of 1945, same time that Jackson is visiting Nuremberg and scouting the courtroom. And Stalin is now meeting with Truman, kind of who is this guy? and both are meeting with Clement Attlee, who has just won the election and replaced Churchill. Who is this guy? And one of the topics they take up at this level is, are we going to do it in an American due process way, or are the Russians going to leave this accountability commitment? And Stalin, with some pushing from Truman, who had gotten pushing from Jackson, who spent time in Potsdam during this conference, basically gives the green light to his London team to agree to the American proposal. So in fast order, the impasse dissolves. Jackson goes back and takes a hard line back in London, and the Russians say, okay. One little tidbit, in the last session in London, the head of the Russian delegation, literally in the last 15 minutes of their last session, he says, by the way, there's just one detail. I keep wondering, what do you mean by the phrase cross-examination? Which shows you that the impasse had been broken, but the cultural divide hadn't quite been bridged. August 6th, 1945, they signed the London Agreement, creating the International Military Tribunal. It has jurisdiction over 4 crimes: conspiracy, breach of the peace, the aggressive war-making, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Procedural addendum defines how the trial will work, and largely it's the way things work right here upstairs. Prosecutors who don't supervise the work of the jurists are independent. The prosecutors have to carry the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The rules of evidence are designed to be liberal and relevant evidence is to be admitted. The accused have the right to counsel, indeed to counsel of choice. Indeed, if they cannot afford it, one will be provided for them. The Americans fund the German defense attorneys. From London and a drafting process producing an indictment, they go to Berlin. This is October of 1945. It is the filing of the indictment in the first session of this International Military Tribunal. This was a sop to the Soviets. You'll remember that Berlin was up in the Soviet sector of occupation. So the ceremonial first meeting occurred on Russian turf. And then they repaired to Nuremberg on American turf to do the first, which turned out to be the only, international trial. Back to this aerial view of the courtroom, and there are the jurists. They functioned as a court of 8. It was a principal and an alternate, but no principal became ill or had to be replaced, and they just acted as a bench of 8. These are the defendants from another angle, and that's Jackson at the podium. On November 21, 1945, he gives the opening statement, and it's one of the most brilliant, eloquent, powerful, enduring courtroom speeches, or speeches, period, in human history. That shows how this trial actually operated. Yes, it was examiners at the podium, and yes, it was witnesses in the stand, but principally it was captured documents. The Nazis were remorseless record keepers, and although much had been destroyed, much more in the end was found, was captured, was analyzed, was translated, and was unimpeachable. So instead of plea bargaining and cutting deals with somebody to become the witness against that person, they could largely try this case on documents. That shows Jackson and some of his core team at the table. This is one witness I want to mention, Rudolf Hearst, who was not a defendant. He was captured during the trial. He was brought as a defendant-requested defense witness and testified in April of 1946. He had been the commandant of Auschwitz. And this trial, which principally was about the war, was about the aggressive Nazi conquering of Europe, turned into a trial not only about that, but about the Holocaust. They discovered the Holocaust, without ever having that word, that comes later, in those documents, and in some witnesses. Hearst comes and he testifies, yes, defendant Kaltenbrunner was never in Auschwitz. That was the part that was helpful to the defendant. And then in cross-examination, he described his job as commandant of Auschwitz. I was assigned by Himmler, who was assigned by the Führer, to exterminate the Jews of occupied Eastern Europe, the general government. And I did the best I could. I was largely successful. To what degree, Mr. Hearst? I exterminated, my people at Auschwitz exterminated 2.5 million people. Now it turns out he was padding the numbers. Holocaust historians have documented that that's about twice what Auschwitz actually exterminated as an industrial operation. But he was giving a job report. This was, wrong kind of salute, excuse me. This was a performance accountability witness who was testifying to this, and the process was learning this in real time. This is Telford Taylor, an important deputy, a member of Jackson's staff, who takes over as the chief of counsel for the 12 subsequent trials, which we're going to hear more about. Jackson returns to the Supreme Court in the fall of 1946, and Taylor supervises and runs the 12 subsequent American trials, which includes the Einsatzgruppen case, which includes the Allstatter case about judges and lawyers. Where does this leave us? Well, this is a shelf in my office. It leaves us with the Nuremberg trial records. The documentary case produced unquestioned documentary knowledge for history. 70 years out, we have Holocaust knowledge. We have deep historiography. We have, yes, Holocaust denial and disturbing things on the fringe, but it's for crackpots because they are up against this, the record of what Nuremberg established. A different kind of case, like a show trial and a firing squad, doesn't produce this knowledge. It produces a perpetual debate across history where some people say the Nazis were horrible, and some say, oh, you know, everybody says some government's horrible. You know, what are the details? And we wouldn't have the details. So the choice to do Nuremberg, the laborious, resource-intensive choice, of course, produced accountability with regard to the individual defendants, but produced something of lasting significance for us and for the world. This is a map of occupation and concentration camps. And I want to sort of finish with this. The red is the fascist alliance, Italy and Germany, and the kind of Greater Reich, and then the yellow is the conquered lands during the maximum footprint of Nazi aggression. You see the whole European continent, you know, down to Vichy France, over to the English Channel, up to most of the Baltic states, over into the Soviet Union, and the dots, white in Germany, are concentration camps, and black in the east are extermination camps, and those are rail lines. The Holocaust, a part of what Nuremberg proved, is a system of degrees and repression to its most awful extremes. In Germany, concentration camps were lockups for political enemies. Dachau, etc., turned into horrible facilities of death, but they weren't designed to be killing factories from the beginning. Whereas in the East, Treblinka and Auschwitz and etc., and of course were the Einsatzgruppen machine gun people at the rims of ditches, those were designed only to kill. Yes, the fit to be worked to death as slave laborers, but the rest to be exterminated. And a map like this is from one of the many Holocaust resource centers and teaching facilities. This one is in Dallas. Of course, you have a great one here in Buffalo. Of course, we have a great one in Washington. There are many great ones in Germany. Use the knowledge of Nuremberg to teach, and I hope to inoculate and to prevent and to make some progress so that we don't repeat some of the horrors that our predecessors committed. That's the process. I apologize for going a little bit over, but I hope that's been a helpful orientation, and like you, I look forward to what comes next. Thank you.